The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room grew silent as Governor Ron DeSantis leaned into his microphone, a confident smile spreading across his face. For nearly 15 minutes, he had carefully laid out his argument against Representative Jasmine Crockett's proposed federal voting rights bill, emphasizing state sovereignty and presenting data that seemed to challenge her main points. Representative Crockett, DeSantis began, his voice steady and clear across the chamber. Your bill would hand federal control over election procedures that the Constitution reserves for the states. Before we go any further, can you identify even one rule in your own state's election laws that stops a legal voter from casting a ballot? The tension in the room rose immediately. Lawmakers shifted uneasily while journalists leaned forward, sensing a dramatic moment ahead. Crockett remained calm, pausing briefly before speaking. Her eyes stayed fixed on the governor. Then she reached for her microphone and spoke in a tone so precise and confident that one veteran Supreme Court reporter later described the moment as constitutional warfare disguised as casual conversation. Governor, Crockett began, her voice calm but unwavering, I have in front of me the transcript of your sworn testimony in Davis v. Florida from last year, where you stated under oath that parts of your own state's election law could indeed prevent eligible citizens from voting. Would you like me to read your exact words for the record? DeSantis's confident smile froze instantly as quiet whispers spread throughout the chamber. What happened next would shift the national debate about voting rights and the limits of executive power. Before diving into this extraordinary exchange, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our latest breakdowns of political showdowns. Representative Jasmine Crockett had become one of Congress's sharpest and most respected legal thinkers. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center and a former civil rights attorney, she had built her career fighting for voting access across the South. At just 42, Crockett had already argued 3 major cases before federal appeals courts, gaining a reputation for her thorough research and calm demeanor under pressure. Her proposed Federal Voter Protection Act was the product of years of legal study and advocacy. Unlike earlier voting rights efforts, her bill was designed to survive constitutional scrutiny by narrowly focusing on removing barriers that unfairly affected vulnerable communities. While still honoring legitimate state interests in election security, this isn't about politics, Crockett said when she first introduced the bill. It's about ensuring that every eligible American can vote freely without unnecessary roadblocks. Governor Ron DeSantis, meanwhile, had risen to national prominence as a staunch defender of state control and election integrity. A Harvard Law graduate and former Navy officer, he had introduced some of the country's toughest election laws in Florida, arguing that they were necessary to prevent fraud, despite very few proven cases. Recently, he launched a national initiative called Secure State Elections, partnering with other governors to push back against what he called federal interference in state election systems. His testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee was meant to highlight his leadership and boost his national profile. The clash between Crockett and DeSantis embodied a deep constitutional conflict, the ongoing question of where to draw the line between state control over elections and the federal duty to protect voting rights. That tension has long divided scholars, lawmakers, and everyday Americans. For months, the rivalry had been building. When Crockett introduced her bill, DeSantis dismissed it as unconstitutional. She responded by citing Supreme Court rulings that upheld Congress's power to regulate federal elections and enforce voting-related amendments. Their conflict grew sharper after the Davis v. Florida case, which challenged parts of Florida's voting laws. During that case, DeSantis had testified under oath about possible barriers for voters. Testimony Crockett had carefully reviewed and brought to the hearing. Everything was set for a high-stakes constitutional showdown between two skilled lawyers with very different views on democracy's foundation. At exactly 10 a.m., Chairman Whitehouse gavelled the hearing to order. Today's session examines Senate Bill 2771, the Federal Voter Protection Act, introduced by Representative Jasmine Crockett. Our first witness is Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. DeSantis stepped confidently to the witness table, neatly arranging his notes before starting his statement. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "I'm here to express my deep concerns about legislation that could upend the constitutional balance between state and federal election authority." For 15 minutes, DeSantis delivered a measured, well-prepared critique of Crockett's bill. He referenced Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, legal precedent, and the principles of federalism, his tone confident and controlled. "The Constitution gives states primary responsibility for managing elections for good reason," he explained. "States are laboratories of democracy, able to craft election procedures that reflect their unique conditions. Federal uniformity would erase this flexibility." Then he switched to data, showing charts that he said proved stricter election laws didn't reduce voter turnout. "In Florida," he noted, "after we strengthened election integrity, participation actually rose across all demographic groups." DeSantis concluded firmly, "These facts completely disprove the foundation of Representative Crockett's proposed legislation." Several Republican members of the committee nodded in approval. The governor's testimony had been strong, a well-prepared defense that would resonate with his political supporters while appearing rooted in constitutional principle rather than partisanship. As the questioning phase began, allied committee members gave DeSantis friendly openings to expand on his arguments. Then Chairman Whitehouse spoke up. "Representative Crockett, you are now recognized for questioning." Crockett leaned toward her microphone with the calm assurance of a seasoned trial lawyer. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said. Turning to face the governor directly, she continued, "Governor, thank you for your testimony today. Glad to be here." "Representative," DeSantis replied with a polite smile. "Governor," Crockett began evenly, "you've spoken at length about the concept of state sovereignty in managing elections. Would you agree that this sovereignty is not unlimited, that it must operate within the boundaries of the Constitution?" DeSantis nodded. "Of course. States must follow constitutional principles, including equal protection under the law. But the Constitution specifically assigns election administration to the states, including determining eligibility requirements. States can create what they view as reasonable regulations on voting, qualifications, and election procedures." Crockett pressed. "That's correct," DeSantis answered carefully. "And who determines what counts as reasonable?" she asked. "Ultimately, the courts review those laws for constitutional compliance," DeSantis admitted. "But the starting point should always be a presumption in favor of state authority." Crockett nodded slowly. "Let's look closer at that presumption. You testified that Florida's election integrity measures increased participation across all voter groups. Could you clarify which specific measures you meant?" DeSantis seemed pleased to elaborate. "Certainly. We implemented voter ID requirements, restricted ballot harvesting, maintained clean and accurate voter rolls, and created clear chain of custody rules for ballots." "And you're saying those policies had no negative impact on any eligible voter?" Crockett asked. "The data speaks for itself," DeSantis replied confidently. "Voter turnout increased across all demographics, including minority communities." "Governor," Crockett continued, "are you familiar with the concept of correlation versus causation?" A brief flicker of irritation crossed DeSantis's face. "Of course. That's a basic statistical principle." "So," Crockett said, "you'd agree that increased turnout might have happened for reasons unrelated to your laws, like higher political engagement or expanded voter outreach?" "Multiple factors can affect turnout," DeSantis admitted. "But the important point is that our laws didn't suppress voting, contrary to what critics predicted." Crockett nodded thoughtfully. "Governor, you're a Harvard-educated lawyer. You know that constitutional rights are not determined by majority convenience. Even if 99% of citizens can exercise a right without difficulty, that doesn't justify blocking the remaining 1%, does it?" "Correct," DeSantis agreed cautiously, aware that the discussion was taking a turn he didn't like. Constitutional rights must be protected for everyone. Then let me ask you something directly, Crockett said, her tone calm but her gaze unflinching. Can you, under oath, state that every eligible voter in Florida can cast a ballot without encountering any substantial obstacles under your current election laws? DeSantis immediately sensed the trap. If he said yes, it could contradict his prior sworn testimony. If he said no, it would undermine his entire argument. He opted for a careful middle ground. Our laws create an election system that's both secure and accessible, he said. Any eligible voter who makes reasonable efforts can successfully cast a ballot. Reasonable efforts, Crockett repeated slowly. That's an interesting phrase. Let's examine what you consider reasonable. She opened a folder in front of her. Governor, I have here the transcript of your deposition from Davis v. Florida, taken on March 14th of last year. Are you familiar with this case? DeSantis's expression shifted, a small tightening around his eyes that only seasoned observers would notice. Yes, I'm familiar with it. During that deposition, Crockett continued, you were asked about specific provisions in Florida's election laws and their potential effects. You were under oath at that time, correct? Yes, just as I am today, DeSantis replied, his tone turning slightly defensive. On page 142 of this transcript, Crockett said, you were questioned about rural voters who live in counties without DMV offices where they can get state-issued IDs. The attorney asked if you recognized that those voters face greater challenges obtaining the required identification. According to this transcript, you responded, and I quote, yes, certain voters may face greater challenges depending on their circumstances. That's an unfortunate reality of any regulatory system. Crockett looked up from the paper. Is that an accurate reflection of your testimony, Governor? DeSantis hesitated. Context matters, Representative, he said. I was acknowledging that no system is flawless. But let me continue. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. Governor, let's look at page 157 of your sworn testimony, she began. You were asked whether Florida's rule against giving water to voters in long lines could make elderly or disabled voters leave before casting their ballot. You answered that, in extreme cases, it could happen, though you said it would be rare. She turned a few pages. And on page 201, you admitted that cutting the number of ballot drop boxes might cause real problems for voters who work irregular hours or lack transportation. Governor, that's your own testimony under oath. You acknowledged that these laws could stop eligible voters from participating. But today, you're saying there are no obstacles to voting. How do you explain that contradiction? The room went still. Lawmakers leaned forward in their seats. Reporters typed faster, sensing a turning point. Governor DeSantis, usually composed and confident, hesitated before answering. Representative Crockett, he said carefully, you're confusing rare theoretical situations with actual voter suppression. Every election system has imperfections. But what matters is the overall outcome, and our data clearly shows participation went up. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. So you're admitting that your laws do create barriers, even if you think they're minor? No system is flawless, DeSantis said, trying to keep his composure. But these isolated cases don't justify the federal government taking over how states run elections. Crockett's tone sharpened slightly. This isn't about perfection, Governor. This is about American citizens being denied their right to vote. You recognize that reality when you testified under oath, but now, when it's politically inconvenient, you deny it. She closed her folder slowly. So tell this committee, which version should we believe? The one under oath, or the one that fits your current talking points? A hint of red crept into DeSantis' face. Representative, you're twisting my words. I've always said our laws aim for both access and security, even if there are rare cases that don't fit perfectly. Theoretical to whom, Governor? Crockett asked, her voice calm but cutting. To the disabled veteran who can't stand in line for hours? To the rural voter who must travel miles to get an ID? To the essential worker who can't reach the polls because you cut early voting hours? Are their rights just theoretical? Before DeSantis could reply, Crockett continued. The Constitution doesn't protect only the voters who are convenient, Governor. It protects everyone, including those your laws make it hardest to vote? The hearing had clearly shifted. What started as a dry debate over constitutional theory had turned into a confrontation about real, human impact, exactly the ground Crockett intended to take. She lifted another document. Governor, I hold here 7 sworn affidavits from Florida voters. Let's start with Mary Wilson, 78 years old, from Gadsden County. She had to travel 67 miles round trip to get a valid ID after her old one was rejected under your new laws. She doesn't drive and had to pay someone $120, nearly a week's worth of groceries, just to meet your new requirement. Tell me, Governor, is her right to vote just another edge case? DeSantis shifted uncomfortably. Individual stories don't prove systemic failure, he said. Our system offers accommodations. Crockett raised another affidavit. James Hernandez, a paramedic who works 12-hour shifts. He used to vote using a drop box near his job. After you cut the number of drop boxes and restricted their hours, he couldn't vote in the last election. This isn't an isolated story, Governor. It's a pattern. These are Americans being blocked from voting by policies you personally pushed. The atmosphere was tense now. Even some committee members who had been nodding with DeSantis earlier were silent. Representative, DeSantis said. His tone defensive. We still have a duty to protect election integrity. Crockett immediately countered. Let's talk about that integrity. She held up another document. This is from your own Florida Division of Elections. From 2000 to 2023, that's 23 years and over 50 million ballots, there were only 153 confirmed cases of voter fraud. That's less than 0.003%. Most of those weren't even deliberate fraud, but clerical mistakes. So, Governor, you've defended laws that stop eligible voters from participating to solve a problem that practically doesn't exist. DeSantis tried to regain control. Representative, even a single fraudulent vote undermines confidence in the system. Crockett didn't hesitate. And a single citizen being denied their constitutional right undermines democracy itself, Governor. You can't protect democracy by denying it to the people. The committee room buzzed as Crockett's words landed. What began as a technical hearing had become a defining moment, not about party or policy, but about the principle at the core of American democracy. Every citizen's right to vote. Excellent. I understand exactly what you need. You want this entire passage rewritten without losing length. Avoiding reused phrasing, keeping it clear and easy to understand, and making it SEO-friendly. So it reads naturally but is optimized for YouTube narration or article performance. Here's your fully rewritten, originalized version, same content, same depth, 0 reused wording, simple language, and keyword-rich phrasing for maximum SEO value. Crockett didn't hesitate to respond. Governor, the difference is clear, she said firmly. Your own data and sworn statements show that your laws have stopped thousands of eligible voters from casting ballots, all to prevent a handful of potential fraudulent votes that you can't even quantify. She picked up the Davis case transcript again and continued. On page 276 of your deposition, you were asked whether you could identify how many fraudulent votes these new laws actually prevented. And your answer under oath was, no, we cannot provide specific numbers because such figures would be speculative. Crockett set the document down. So by your own admission, you can't prove that these laws stop fraud. But you can confirm they block eligible Americans from voting. Governor, how is that a reasonable or constitutional balance? For the first time during the hearing, DeSantis looked visibly unsettled. His usual calm confidence gave way to unease. Representative, he began, election integrity isn't only about counting proven fraud cases. It's also about maintaining public confidence in the fairness of elections. Voter confidence, Crockett repeated, leaning slightly forward. Interesting you mentioned that, Governor. She lifted another document. This is polling data from Florida's Secretary of State. Before your so-called integrity laws took effect, 79% of voters said they trusted the election process. After your measures were implemented, that confidence fell to 71%. So your laws reduced public trust, they didn't strengthen it. A murmur rippled through the hearing room. Reporters typed rapidly, realizing the moment had shifted. What began as an opportunity for DeSantis to defend his constitutional philosophy was turning into a test of credibility. Chairman Whitehouse finally spoke. The representative's time has expired. Governor, you may give a brief response. DeSantis straightened slightly, trying to recover his footing. Public polling changes all the time, he said. The real issue here is that the Constitution gives states, not Washington, the authority to manage elections. Crockett requested 1 more minute, and the chairman agreed. She turned back to DeSantis. Governor, this isn't a question of federal versus state power, she said. It's a question of the Constitution versus state laws that violate it. You've admitted, under oath, that your laws put up barriers for eligible voters. States do control their election systems, but that authority doesn't extend to denying constitutional rights. She paused, then spoke with deliberate clarity. The 15th Amendment forbids discrimination in voting based on race. The 19th protects women's right to vote. The 26th ensures every citizen over 18 can vote. And the 14th guarantees equal protection under the law. My bill doesn't take elections away from states. It simply ensures state laws obey the Constitution. Crockett fixed her gaze on DeSantis. Governor, you swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, not to a political theory about state sovereignty that lets you decide whose votes count. By your own testimony, your laws have prevented eligible Americans from voting. That's not constitutional governance, Governor. That's precisely what the Constitution forbids. The hearing room fell completely silent. DeSantis, usually sharp and quick to respond, looked momentarily speechless. Lawmakers exchanged glances, aware they had just witnessed a rare moment of substance, a debate stripped of political spin and grounded entirely in constitutional principle. By the end of the day, the exchange dominated headlines. News outlets from every political corner ran the story. The Washington Post summarized it best. Crockett uses DeSantis' own words to expose contradictions on voting rights. Their coverage noted that her approach stood out not for partisanship, but for precision, methodically using the governor's sworn statements to challenge his public claims. Even conservative commentators acknowledged her performance. The National Review ran a piece titled "A Lesson in Constitutional Preparation," crediting Crockett's calm, evidence-based questioning as a model for how congressional oversight should work, grounded in facts. Not theatrics. For Governor DeSantis, the fallout was immediate. His aides first tried to dismiss the moment as political theater, but that narrative fell flat as millions viewed the full exchange online. The hearing's viral clips showed not a partisan clash, but a governor being held accountable by his own testimony. 3 days later, DeSantis appeared on a sympathetic cable network to address the controversy. I continue to support Florida's election integrity laws, he said. However, I also recognize that we must keep improving how these laws are implemented to ensure all eligible voters can participate. Representative Crockett made some points worth considering, though I still disagree with federal involvement in this area. His words signaled a subtle shift, a rare moment of acknowledgement after a confrontation that had already become one of the most talked about congressional exchanges of the year. The governor's unexpectedly moderate response caught many political analysts off guard. Experts who had expected a combative follow-up were surprised by his measured tone. A political scientist at the University of Virginia observed, "When someone as seasoned as Governor DeSantis takes a softer, more conciliatory approach, it signals recognition that the earlier exchange didn't unfold as intended. He's trying to minimize damage and reshape public perception." For Representative Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath brought a wave of national attention, not only to her proposed legislation but also to her calm, constitutional method of oversight. Law schools around the country reached out for permission to include footage of the hearing in their courses on constitutional law and congressional process. The American Bar Association invited her to headline its annual voting rights conference. In a surprising display of bipartisanship, 3 Republican senators privately approached Crockett to discuss possible revisions to her bill that could ease genuine, state-level concerns while preserving strong constitutional protections. "Your focus stayed on the Constitution, not politics," one senator told her. That makes real dialogue possible. Most importantly, the confrontation sparked a far-reaching public discussion about how constitutional rights interact with state control of election procedures. Editorial boards nationwide published opinion pieces, exploring that balance between state authority and the federal duty to protect voting rights. One constitutional scholar, writing for The Atlantic, summarized it best: "We can't claim loyalty to the Constitution while defending laws that, by their author's own admission, restrict the rights the Constitution guarantees." 6 months later, the ripple effects were still visible. Florida's legislature passed modest but meaningful reforms addressing some of the barriers Crockett had exposed, including expanded ID options for older voters and longer drop-box hours. Though Governor DeSantis never directly linked these changes to the hearing, political observers widely interpreted them as quiet recognition of the weaknesses Crockett had revealed. The influence went beyond Florida. Several other states began adding accessibility impact assessments when drafting new election laws to evaluate how changes might affect different groups of voters. Election officials from both parties launched the Accessible Democracy Initiative, a coalition dedicated to removing barriers that disproportionately harm vulnerable communities. Meanwhile, Crockett's original Federal Voter Protection Act evolved through bipartisan collaboration. She incorporated several practical suggestions from both Republican and Democratic colleagues. The revised version kept the core constitutional safeguards intact while granting states more flexibility in how to implement them. This balanced approach drew support from moderate lawmakers on both sides, creating a realistic path toward passage that few believed possible before her. Confrontation with DeSantis. For constitutional scholars, the Crockett-DeSantis exchange became a landmark example of effective legislative oversight. As one Georgetown law professor explained, what made it historic wasn't partisanship, it was discipline. Representative Crockett grounded every question in constitutional text and factual evidence, forcing a real reckoning between principles and consequences. 3 years later, when a major voting rights case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, several justices cited testimony first introduced during the Crockett-DeSantis hearing. The majority opinion even quoted Crockett's words directly. "The Constitution doesn't protect only the rights of citizens who are easy to accommodate. It protects all Americans, for ordinary Americans." The hearing offered rare clarity in an often confusing political landscape. "I wasn't sure what to believe about these voting laws before," said a retired teacher from Ohio, "but when I saw Representative Crockett calmly lay out real examples and use the governor's own words against him, it all made sense." This isn't about party politics, it's about whether every citizen's vote really counts. The experience left both figures changed. Governor DeSantis appeared more cautious, and perhaps wiser, in later discussions about constitutional limits. In future interviews, he avoided sweeping claims and acknowledged the need for continuous improvements to protect access. That humility, while less dramatic, earned him credibility among moderate voters. Representative Crockett, meanwhile, stayed consistent in her disciplined, evidence-driven approach. Even with her newfound prominence, she resisted pressure to chase headlines or adopt an aggressive tone. "My goal isn't to create viral clips," she said in an interview. "My job is to make sure our laws keep their constitutional promises to every American. That takes research, preparation, and principle, not personality." Ultimately, the true legacy of the Crockett-DeSantis confrontation wasn't a partisan victory. It was a reminder that genuine oversight depends on exposing the gap between what leaders say and what their policies actually do. In an era dominated by political spectacle, their exchange stood out as a rare moment of serious, fact-based constitutional debate that crossed party lines. If you found this analysis informative, remember to comment, and subscribe for more detailed coverage of today's most pressing constitutional and political issues. Share your thoughts below. How do you think the balance between state authority and constitutional protections should shape America's voting systems?